It's day 2 of the prosecution's case in chief in the federal trial of the 3 convicted murderers who chased and gunned down Ahmaud Arbery almost 2 years ago. Federal prosecutors say Travis and Gregory McMichael and William Bryan targeted Ahmaud because he was black. Today, they called FBI Special Agent Amy Vaughn to the stand. She testified to finding several racist messages and memes on the cell phones and social media posts of the defendants. They frequently used the N-word and would refer to black people as savages and monkeys. All 3 men were convicted of murder back in November and sentenced to life in prison last month. Now to Minneapolis for the federal trial of the 3 former officers charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights. Today, the jury heard testimony from 2 of the defendants, Tou Thao and J. Alexander King. Thomas Lane is also expected to testify. All 3 are accused of depriving Floyd of medical care, with King and Thao also charged with failing to intervene while Derek Chauvin dug his knee into Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. Here to discuss today's testimony are former prosecutors Bernarda, Villalona and Titus, Nichols. Glad to have you both back on. Listen, let's start with Tou Thao. He was back on the stand for cross-examination today. Prosecutor Leigh Ann Bell started off by questioning Thao about images taken from the scene as George Floyd struggled under the knee of Derek Chauvin. Now, according to reporters inside the courtroom, Bell became visibly frustrated after a series of defense objections were sustained by the judge. Now, we're all former prosecutors here, right? And we understand how rare it is to cross-examine a defendant, and if we get that chance, how valuable that opportunity can be. So did the prosecution rise to the occasion? Bernarda.
So I definitely think the prosecution did what they wanted to do. You got to think that the prosecution was excited, was waiting for this moment to be able to cross-examine them. Because remember, no one has heard from these officers, former officers. No one knows what was in their minds at the time when George Floyd was dying right in front of them. So I think the prosecution definitely did what they needed to do. And in addition to that, you got to think the prosecution was ready for this cross-examination because you know what made it easy? Everything was on video. So there was nothing that was going to be a surprise to them. So let's see how the jury took it.
Titus, I mean, this is after, a day, yesterday that is, where the defense got to peel back a few of the layers to show the jury who their client is, Tou Thao, beyond just that one day. So again, prosecution, did they rise to the occasion?
The thing the prosecution has in their favor is the fact that you have the trial that already took place of Derek Chauvin, in which he was found guilty of murdering George Floyd. The other 3 officers' entire defense has been, well, I trusted the other officers. I thought they knew what they were doing. I thought everything was okay. In a situation like this, you can't play dumb while a man is being killed and then say, oh, well, I thought that the officer of 19 years, he knew what he was doing. Officer Thao tried to go through that direction, and of course his attorney was objecting simply to throw off the prosecution's rhythm in showing the fact that Thao had a complete disregard for George Floyd's humanity.
Well, you bring up a very good point, and it actually tees up my next question perfectly. So Thao on cross-examination was asked, did you ever ask Chauvin to get off Floyd? He responded, I did not. I think I would trust a 19-year veteran to figure it out. So to your point, back to you, Titus. Oh, Bernard, go ahead, jump in.
I think that's probably the best line that Thao had during his entire direct examination as well as cross-examination, because that statement is so powerful that works in his favor, is that they're bringing the focus again on Derek Chauvin, who has multiple years of experience, who is the senior officer there, who is the training officer there, and who you will defer to look at in terms of making decisions on the scene. You got to think during Tao's entire testimony, what was he doing? He was like, look, I was relying on my fellow officers to make the decisions, but especially Chauvin, because he is the senior officer, or more experienced than all of us combined.
Well, okay, well, let me push back just a little bit, because you have, yes, that's a great line. It's always a good idea to blame the guy that's already been convicted and did much worse than, all three put together. But you have Lane, right, because he's one of the defendants that's going to be taking the stand, who actually did try and suggest, he may not have told Chauvin to get off George Floyd, but he did suggest on 2 occasions, maybe we should reposition George Floyd, put him on his side, and to which Chauvin declined his suggestion. So when you have someone who's been on the job for 8 days into their training, and then you have Tou Thao who's been on the force for 8 years, that kind of flies in the face of his logic. Don't you agree, Titus?
The bigger problem is the fact that no one stopped Derek Chauvin, because at the time, no one disagreed with Chauvin. Everyone there thought that it was completely okay to treat George Floyd that type of way. Now that they've seen the aftermath, the fact that he's been murdered, now everybody wants to play dumb and say, oh, well, I thought that Derek Chauvin knew what he was doing. I was just following his lead. But the fact comes back to it, as a trained police officer, you go to the academy for months and are trained on how to protect life, not to simply sit and watch another police officer kill a person and then say, oh, well, he's been on the force longer than me, so I thought what he was doing was appropriate. You don't need to have someone tell you that's wrong when you've been trained that way.
I may disagree with the both of y'all, at least when it comes to Officer Lane. I think in his own way, being a rookie and having to work with someone who's training him, his way of telling Chauvin to get off of Floyd was to make those suggestions on 2 occasions. We'll hear what he has to say on the stand when he takes it. So let's move on to King, who took the stand. He now was asked by his attorney, and agreed with his attorney, that cadets are taught unquestioned obedience and that probationary officers can be fired at will. When his attorney asked if that was something that King worried about, he said, every shift, sir. Bernarda.
Absolutely. You got to think that he is right. He is correct. As a probationary officer, you can be fired. You can be fired during that probationary period, and you're not even entitled to a hearing despite you being a police officer. But again, Yodit, look, I don't need training for you to tell me common sense that when someone is pleading for their life, they're telling you that they cannot breathe, and you have evidence that someone is putting their knee on the neck of the same person who's saying I can't breathe, and other people telling you that he's suffering and he can't breathe. Are you telling me that you need to be trained to say, oh, let's give him medical attention? Oh, maybe we shouldn't be leaning or applying so much pressure on this human being. That is what is so upsetting, that even though you're relying on your training, it's just common sense. It's just humanity. You don't need training to be like, let's exercise some kind of empathy, or just to think about that we are all human and we hurt and bleed the same.
Well, that definitely was the case when, you even had bystanders who weren't officers trained for months on end telling them, listen, there's something wrong. You need to check on this man. Let's talk about the ways in which their testimony could possibly hurt the other, right? We know that all three they're going to take the stand. We know that they all played different roles that day. We know that they're at least all going to say this is Chauvin's fault. He was the veteran officer that day. We just listened to him. But can each of their testimony actually hurt the other co-defendants? Titus.
It would depend on if their testimony is implicating one of the other co-defendants. To simply say, I was holding George Floyd's legs, you'd have to say, I was doing it because Thao ordered me to, and I was afraid of contradicting what Thao told me to do. Unless their testimony implicates the co-defendant and says that they were acting at the direction or in support of a co-defendant, it's really just a matter of them trying to find a way to make up an excuse for the jury to explain their lack of actions while they watched George Floyd being killed.
All right, guys. Attorneys Bernarda Villalona and Titus Nichols, always a pleasure to get your insight into these issues. Thank you so much.